Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 69. The mission of our Digging Deeper moment is to take God's Word to God's world. We're glad that you joined us. Last week, we began looking at the background of the Bible and saw that Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, go against the conventional wisdom of its day when it declares that there is one God who is eternal and who created the universe. When Moses wrote these words, it was like swimming upstream. He was going against the current of his culture. What he writes in Genesis 1, verses 3 through 25, which, by the way, records the 6 days of creation, also goes against the grain of the culture of his day. Just consider this. On the first day, God said, "Let there be light." That's verse 3, and there was light. On the second day, God said, "Let there be a firmament," or "Let there be a sky." That's verse 6. On the third day, God said, "Let the waters be gathered into one place." That's verse 9. On the fourth day, God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass," and all the trees and stuff, verse 11. On the fifth day, God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament," verse 14. On the sixth day, God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living things. Let the earth bring forth the living creatures, and let us make man in our own image and according to our likeness." This is verse 20, 24, and 28. Now, it is not in the scope of this study to discuss the different ways that the 6 days of creation are interpreted. That'll have to wait for another series. Our goal in this series is to see how the background of the Bible illuminates what is written in it. We saw last week that the nations in the world around Israel, they were polytheistic, meaning that they believed in many gods. However, their belief in many gods was not just a religious belief. It wasn't disconnected from their everyday lives. Their belief in the gods, if you will, was how they believed the real world worked. This is called mythology. When we hear the words myth or mythology, we immediately think of something that's not true. We think of Superman, we think of Wonder Woman. Enjoyable movies to watch, but not based in reality. But to the ancient world, mythology was not the belief in something that was not true. It is what they believed about how the world worked. Mythology was their worldview. John Walton, who's an expert in ancient cultures, writes in Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. He writes, "A Babylonian would consider the myths important because they offered explanations on how the world functioned. The Sumerians seem to have perceived mythological reality as historically actual. In other words, it really happened. Their mythology was their worldview, and their mythology was based on observation. They saw the sun rise, they saw the sun set. They saw the sky and the clouds in the day and the stars in the sky at night. In fact, the entire creation account found here in Genesis chapter 1 is not written from God's perspective of Him looking down on the earth. It's written from the perspective of someone standing on the earth and looking up at the sky and the stars. We'll have to come back to that in another series as well. But as the people looked up in the sky, they developed a mythology, a belief about how the world functions and how it works from an earthly perspective. And so what God does in chapter 1 is in chapter 1 here, He's going to speak to them about how the world's created from their perspective. This is called contextualization. But one of the things they came to believe as they observed the sky and the world the way that the sun came up, went down, and the stars came up, is they began to see the world as full of gods and being run by the gods. And so they began to see the gods as behind everything. So behind the sun was a god causing it to function. Behind the moon was a god causing it to function. And behind every star was a god causing them to function. Another thing they came to believe in was that something called the great symbiosis. This is the belief that the gods had needs like human beings do, and so they created humanity to meet those needs. This is what they believed when Moses penned these words in Genesis. In other words, when Moses wrote the creation account found here in Genesis 1, they believed that the world and the universe was run by a plethora, a number of gods, and that the gods, they were kind of like the queen bees in a hive. They're the queen bees of the world, and we human beings are the worker bees. In other words, they looked at humans as slaves of the gods. As we get further into our study, we're going to see this is very relevant when we look at the nation of Israel, who at this time had just been taken out of this land of Egypt and freed from slavery. And what God's going to do here in the Bible is what He's doing here is He's laying down a foundation for Israel to stay free. He's giving them an understanding of how the world was created and how it works that's disassociated from the gods so that they could stay free and they would not let anybody enslave them once again. Once again, that's for another time. Now, the people living at this time also believed that the only reason that the gods blessed them was so that their needs, the needs of the gods, could be met. And the idea was that if people weren't blessed, the people couldn't provide food for the gods. So they believed that the gods gave them fertility, that the gods sent them rain and gave them good crops so that they could feed the gods, not so much themselves. So they didn't see the gods as loving and benevolent, nor did they worship them out of love. They didn't love the gods, they feared the gods. In fact, they believed the gods were selfish. They believed that the gods were basically, they had the same weaknesses and flaws as mortal men, but they had more power as well as immortality. So they didn't love the gods. They simply feared the gods, and they feared that they would lose the gods' blessings. So they did all kinds of rituals and incantations to try to keep the gods happy. Now, these beliefs are quite comical to us today. But to them living at that time, this is how they believed the real world worked. They thought this is how the world operated. Now, what the Bible does here in Genesis, the Bible is so far ahead of its time. This is the amazing thing about the Bible. When I read the Bible and I study science and I study various subjects, which I do, I'm always amazed at how the Bible's already ahead of anything we can conclude. Because what the Bible does here in Genesis, and we'll see through the various chapters of Genesis and the rest of the Bible, that what the Bible does is it removes the myths. It removes the mythology. In contrast to the dominant worldview of the day, the Genesis account removes or demythologizes the creation account. It takes the myth out of it. You know, the first readers of Genesis would have been very acutely aware of this, because when they read the story, they would have seen very quickly what is missing in the whole Genesis account. And what's missing are the gods. Because in their world, gods were everywhere, but there's no gods. There's only one God, not many gods, talked about in the Genesis account. Some of you may remember the days, I know I do, I was just a kid then, but I remember the days when they used to put lead in gasoline. So when you went into the gas station, you could drive up and you get leaded or unleaded gas. It was your choice. Now, that's not the case. All gas is unleaded. And that's because they took the lead out. And that's what the Bible does here in the creation account. It takes the lead out. It takes the gods out of creation. And this went against the worldview of the ancient world. Because the ancient world saw nature as personal. Let me say that again. The ancient world saw nature as personal. It was the realm occupied and controlled by the gods. So behind everything in nature was some kind of personal deity. In contrast, the Bible portrays nature as impersonal and the one who created nature as personal. Let me say that again as well. The Bible portrays nature as impersonal and the one who created nature as personal. Now, folks, there's a world of difference between those two things. And you're going to find that all the way through the Scriptures. And that truth, those truths, and these truths that we'll learn in the Bible made modern living possible. It made science possible. It made our belief in not being at the whims of the gods and their capriciousness. It made that all possible so that we could produce our scientific and modern world. It's quite fascinating when you study it. Therefore, as we conclude this, just as we saw last week in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, we see again in chapter 1, verses 3 through 25, that the Bible goes against the conventional wisdom and the dominant worldview of the day. God creates the light, God creates the sky, God creates the stars, God creates the land, God creates the animals, God creates humanity, and God runs the world, not the gods. You could say it like this: God rules and the gods drool. That's what you read in the Genesis account. That is what the ancient world would have heard when they read Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 25. So I ask you to consider a thought. In light of this and how this contrasts the dominant worldviews and the conventional thinking of the day, could it be that we as Christ followers today need to get more comfortable with going against conventional wisdom and the dominant worldviews that are out there? Just a thought. Next week, we'll begin to look at the background of the Bible and how it illuminates the creation of humanity and mankind. If you enjoyed this lesson, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I hope to see you next week. God bless.